As the 1930s came to an end, one of the big things that was happening was contested tensions throughout Europe, but also globally. One of the things I hope you all remember is that China and Japan had had many competitions in parts of Asia for much of the early 1900s, right? You'll remember the Sino-Japanese War, and you'll probably hopefully remember that Japan also expands their territory in the Russo-Japanese War. You also have Japan starting to invade parts of Manchuria, northern China. You have something called the Manchurian Incident in the early 1930s, where Japan goes into Manchuria, blows up its own railroad in Manchuria, blames it on the Chinese, and ultimately what you have happening is this sort of allows for Japan to invade Manchuria, and throughout the next 10 years, Japan continues to expand their territory south in China. We'll look at a map of that in a second. You also have Japan expanding into territories in the Pacific Ocean. And Japan's major beef or major concern is that they are being neglected throughout European politics, right? Japan is now a strong nation. It should have, or it believes, more territory and be allowed to expand its territory. So I hope you see that in the next few moments. So I hope you'll remember from the other day that one of the big things that happens is both Italy and Germany are disaffected by the Treaty of Versailles, but also Japan is disaffected by this as well, right? They are on the side of the winners in at the end of World War I, and they are being neglected in the Treaty of Versailles. And there's expansionary policies that are put into place throughout Europe, right? So one of the things that happens is Germany starts to expand its territory throughout throughout the 1930s, particularly after 1935. And Japan does as well, right? So Japan, as I said, invaded Manchuria in the early 1930s, and then they continue to expand southward into um, China and down towards Beijing, getting there around about the end of the 1930s, 1937. They also continue to expand in Southeast Asia and then obviously into different islands throughout the Pacific, right? Obviously, getting very dangerously close to the American territory, not state yet, of Hawaii. So the United States is using its Navy, particularly the Navy that is based at Pearl Harbor, obviously leading to the major event that happens there in December of 1941. So what happens then to lead to the beginning of the war, right? So we already know, I hope you can see, that China and Japan are already at war, right? China and Japan are already at war in the 1930s, fighting over the territory here in northern China. And in Europe, Germany has continued to expand, so that you have the Germans taking over the Rhineland, the area around the Rhine River. They've taken over parts of Czechoslovakia. They've taken over Austria and the Anschluss, the Union. They've taken over different territories. And Germany is expanding its power, right? So the last peace in 1930, so in 1938, Hitler and the Nazis make an agreement with Joseph Stalin and the communists of the Soviet Union called the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. And this Non-Aggression Pact basically is that, right? They're not going to invade each other. They're not going to attack each other. But what they wind up doing here is they wind up agreeing that they can divide up this territory, what's called the Polish Corridor, parts of Poland, what would become Poland. So on September 1st, 1939, the Germans invade this territory along with the Soviets coming from the other side, right? The Soviets come from the western side, the Germans come from the eastern side, and they invade the sort of Polish territory here. Um, so the Germans then invade using what is called the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe is their air force. It's this fast-moving airplanes who then bomb their territory, their targets. This is part of the larger Blitzkrieg, right? The Lightning War, this fast-moving infantry style. There's infantry. There's tanks. It's a very multifaceted approach, and the Germans move very quickly. So they start invading with the Luftwaffe and Blitzkrieg, and then in 1940 they start moving through Belgium into northern France, and ultimately France winds up surrendering by June of 1940, relatively quickly into the war. And then you have the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, where they bomb, where the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, bombs British targets, incessantly for 30 plus days. As I said, the Nazi-Soviet pact is something that happens in 1938-39, but what ultimately winds up happening is Germany invades Russia in 1941, and that sort of gives up the Nazis. The Soviets are no longer willing to have that agreement. Japan obviously is occupying much of China in the 1930s, and then once Japan invades or attacks Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, this pushes the United States into war. So the war is again another war of attrition, much like World War One. Two decades ahead of it, but this is a war that spreads out for many, many years, right? It starts in Europe, at least in 1939. It starts in Asia in the early 1930s. And for the next, 6 or 7 years in Europe and so on, millions of people are going to die, right? And now the crazy thing about this is it's not just civilians. It's also obviously, it's many troops. The Soviet Union basically just keeps throwing soldiers at the fight. It is something that winds up taking, tens of millions of lives. And you have, obviously, the Holocaust, where you have 12 million people generally. 6 million Jews are killed during this, right? This calculated, industrialized killing of so many people. As the Great Depression was going on and Germany was in massive free fall in terms of needing more territory, and Japan was looking for more territory, both countries really aimed at trying to expand their own possessions. So you have Germany expanding, and we have Germany and Japan expanding in their respective territories. So much of World War I is beginning as a period of territorial land grab, both because it sort of territory showed your military prowess, your strength, but it also was an economic resource. So you have, obviously, this map here shows you the German territorial expansion. And the goal here is to expand really sort of limitlessly. This map is a little tough to read, but it's also important to understand, right, that Europe is the war I suppose we know most about from videos and other things like that. But it's important to also notice that that the war is going on very much in Japan, and territorial expansion is going on in Japan and in Asia as well. So yes, you have obviously Germany taking over parts of France and absorbing parts of France. Then you have Vichy France, which is southern France, which is obviously a territory that becomes a puppet state of the Germans. You have Germany expanding eastward, into the Soviet Union. And obviously Italy is involved here too, right? Italy as Germany's ally. When you look at Asia, you have Japan taking over all these territories here in the Pacific. So the expansion of this territory really makes both sides very difficult to defeat. So when we start moving into 1944, right, you have June 1944, the invasion of D-Day, right? So the British leave southern England and invade northern France at Normandy, and then start beating back the Germans in June of 1944, and then obviously the war ending in May of 1945. Well, at least the European War, May 8th, 1945. But you also then have in Asia, right? Japan has conquered all of these islands, so the Americans have to start doing a policy of what is called island hopping, and that's the phrase that I have here. Island hopping is this strategy where the Americans basically win one island, hop to the next, win one island, hop to the next, and you keep taking over these territories. The only problem is this is very costly. These tropical islands are filled with disease. You have Japanese military troops who are, ruthless. So all of this period is having massive death for both the Americans and the Japanese. So when we start getting to 1945, the quest then becomes, how do we end this war more quickly without so many deaths? So the Americans obviously have developed the atomic bomb by 1945 under the FDR administration. FDR dies in April of 1945, and President Harry Truman takes over. Truman then understands the atomic weapon, and obviously then in August of 1945, Germany had surrendered in May 8th. Japan still hasn't surrendered, so in August of 1945, the United States drops 2 bombs, one at Hiroshima, the other at Nagasaki, to finally wipe out the Japanese territory. And at that point, then, we can start talking about the end of the war, and ultimately the beginning of the Cold War. The documents they're going to be looking at today are looking at sort of how the United States, how nationalism and territorial expansion played a large portion in the development of World War II. I've taken 2 documents, both of them from 1939, in which you have, for Japan, a discussion of nationalism, right? Territorial expansion as a goal of nationalism. And you'll see here that the justification is very nationalistic. I would also say here down in Hitler's Ober-Salzberg speech, it's the same idea. How do we establish this idea of Lebensraum? I will also point out to you that Lebensraum, the word Lebensraum, which is down here, is the idea of living space, right? That Germany needs territory in order to expand their own control. All right, good luck, guys.